My name is Renske and I'm a postdoctoral scholar at Stanford University. And today I'm going to talk about the impact of daytime illuminance on cognitive functioning and alertness. And this is work that I've done in part at the University of Groningen under the supervision of Professor Roelof Hut and Professor Domien Beersma, and part at Stanford University with my current supervisor, Jamie Seitzer. Today I'm basically going to try to fill in a little bit of this schematic overview regarding the effects of light on subjective alertness, mental performance, and how these depend on homeostatic sleep pressure and the circadian clock. Alerting effects of light occur during the night. So this is a beautiful publication in 2000, which indicates a clear dose-dependent relationship between the intensity of light on the x-axis and the subjective alerting response on the y-axis. So here we can see that at low light intensities, light does not really induce alertness. At increasing light intensities, light significantly improves subjective feelings of alertness. And at really high intensities, this effect basically saturates. So it doesn't matter if you give more light above a certain point, people are not going to feel more alert. And this is not just subjective alertness, but this also accounts for other parameters of alertness, such as slow eye movements and EEG power density. However, humans have evolved as a diurnal species with a peak in activity predominantly during the daytime. So in the end, it's most interesting to us, at least, to see if we can improve daytime alertness, because that's in the end when we are awake and when we are performing. There are many differences between the night and the day. So for example, during the active phase, we have increased temperature, we're feeding, we're more active. Whereas during the night, of course, we have the rise of the nocturnal hormone melatonin. And during the day, we have cortisol. So we cannot take for granted that the dose-response curve happening at night is going to translate during the day. But we tried to investigate this. And basically what we did is we set up a really nice experiment, testing at multiple times during the day and controlling for many different conditions that I won't have the time to go into. And basically we based our light intensities upon this article, this Kajochen 2000 article, basically choosing very low light intensities to stimulate our participants with, like about 24 photopic lux, and going as high as about 2000 photopic lux, just to see if we can induce alertness during the day. And the very unsatisfying answer is basically no. There's no dose-response curve during the daytime. So here we have subjective alertness, but also blink duration, which is a parameter of alertness, and the distal proximal gradient, which is a skin temperature gradient, is also a parameter of alertness. And we can see that none of these dots follow that beautiful dose-dependent matter that we so nicely saw during the nighttime. This was after about 20 minutes of light exposure at various times of day. After about an hour of light exposure, not much is different. We still cannot find a nice dose-dependent relationship between light intensity and the parameters of interest. So the very unsatisfying conclusion has to be that light during the day does not really induce alertness, depending on light intensity at least. Now here at Stanford, we did a couple of experiments looking into the spectral composition of light. So basically, if there are different colors of light in there, can that at least induce some alertness during the day? So here also we tested at different clock time hours, so 9 a.m., 12 p.m. and 3 p.m. with different colors. So low melanopic EDI is light that's a bit more red in the spectrum. Medium melanopic EDI is polychromatic white light that's a bit more blue, and high melanopic EDI is polychromatic white light with a lot of blue light. And we can find no alerting effects during the daytime depending on the spectral composition. So neither light intensity nor the spectral composition really matters for alertness during the daytime. So that leads to this very unsatisfying first part of our diagram, where light during the night can increase subjective alertness, but light during the day does not. And then the big question, of course, becomes why? And there are many differences between the night and the day, as I pointed out before. And one is actually the homeostatic sleep pressure component and the circadian component. So this is a very famous model, the two-process model of sleep. in which the big bold line indicates homeostatic sleep pressure buildup and dissipation, and the dotted line indicates the SCN, so the suprachiasmatic nucleus, that cycles with a period of approximately 24 hours. And these two periods, they work together to induce sleep. So when homeostatic sleep pressure is high and the circadian clock is promoting sleep, an individual will fall asleep. And when homeostatic sleep pressure is low and the circadian system is promoting wakefulness, an individual will wake up. Now, if we look at the dose response curve during the night, they measured at this point where homeostatic sleep pressure is really high and the circadian clock is promoting sleep. Whereas we, during our daytime experiments, measure at these time points where the circadian clock is promoting wakefulness and homeostatic sleep pressure is relatively low. So we have two factors that are interfering with each other, the homeostatic sleep pressure component and the circadian component. And one of the best ways to disentangle these two is something that's called a forced asynchrony protocol. And in a forced asynchrony protocol, what you do is you impose a day-night cycle that significantly deviates from 24 hours on humans. So in this case, we chose a light dark cycle that lasts for 18 hours, 5 hours for sleep and 13 hours for wakefulness. And this is such a short day-night cycle that the circadian clock cannot enter into it. And that means that the circadian clock will free run, so tick according to its own intrinsic rhythm. So this is a simulated circadian clock throughout the protocol. But that means, since we have dedicated intervals for sleep and for wakefulness, that we know at each of these circadian clock phases, we have different amounts of homeostatic sleep pressure. So for example, if we were to assess alertness at 6 p.m., in this case, participants have been up for approximately 13 hours. In this case, participants have been up for only a couple of hours. And here, participants have been up for maybe 5 hours. So we have a combination of different amounts of homeostatic sleep pressure depending on the same circadian clock phase. And then mathematically, we can disentangle these two. In reality, the design is way more complex, obviously. We took lots of melatonin samples. So we started with the dim light melatonin onset, 5 intervals for sleep, 13 hours for wakefulness, and we tested alertness in regular intervals every 2 hours. We kept the participants in our facility for 5 consecutive 24-hour days. And in that way, we could measure the circadian clock phase and the effects of homeostatic sleep pressure. I know this is a really complicated design, so I'm happy to answer any questions that come up. So the results. So first of all, usually in forced asynchrony designs, melatonin is used as an output marker of the circadian clock. But we did this design under dim and under bright light, since we want to assess alerting effects of light. And of course, we encountered melatonin suppression. So under dim light conditions, we can see beautiful traces of the circadian clock with a nice 24-hour pattern. So it's nicely free running. But under bright light, we can see that there's bright light-induced melatonin suppression. And that means that we cannot really assess what the circadian clock is doing in these moments, for example. So if we don't know what the circadian clock is doing at all of these phases, it's going to be really hard to disentangle circadian clock phase from homeostatic sleep pressure levels. So we need another circadian marker. So we turn to cortisol. So here we have plotted the levels of cortisol. And we can see that also these show beautiful traces of the circadian clock. So nicely 3 periods, 3 cycles actually. And we can see that the white and the black dots that represent the bright and the dim light are completely overlapping. So we don't have any effects of light on cortisol concentrations, and therefore we can use cortisol as an output measure to determine where the circadian clock is throughout all phases of our protocol. In that case, if we look at our alerting effects of light, what can we see? So here we have subjective alertness. We measured the reaction time on the PVT, which is a very simple reaction time task, basically press as soon as you hear a tone. And we have a go, no go reaction time task, which is press only if the correct tone is presented. So if we look at subjective alertness, we can see that people wake up relatively alert. So this is time since sleep offset. People wake up relatively alert and they go to sleep relatively sleepy. So there's a trajectory from wakefulness to sleep. So this means that there's an effect of being awake on your alertness. If we look at performance, these effects aren't as strong, basically meaning it doesn't matter how long you've been awake, for 13 hours consecutively at least. It's not really going to affect how well you perform on these relatively simple reaction time tasks. But then the big question is, what happens if we induce light? So if we look at bright light on subjective alertness, we can see that participants still wake up relatively alert and they still go to bed relatively sleepy, but the trajectory from alert to sleepy is different compared to the dim light condition. So we can see that people stay alert for longer under bright light conditions. If we look at performance, people significantly improve their performance under the bright light conditions, and this is about 1400 lux. And this does not depend on the time of being awake. So again, we don't see an effect of how long you've been awake. They always will perform better under bright light, but it's a significant improvement. That means that we kind of resolved the first part of our puzzle. So light has an effect through homeostatic sleep pressure on subjective alertness, in which it can make you feel very much alert depending on how long you've been awake. Light can also affect mental performance, but this is independent of the amount of homeostatic sleep pressure, because it always induces significant improvements. Then let's take a look at the circadian clock. So here we have the circadian variation depicted on the x-axis, in which circadian phase 0 is dim light melatonin onset. And we can see a beautiful circadian variation in subjective alertness, meaning people become less alert after dim light melatonin onset, and here people become more alert again. This circadian variation is not as strong and actually not present at all in our performance. So neither in the PVT nor in the go-no-go do we see a nice circadian variation. So what happens if we look at bright light? We can see a dampening of the circadian amplitude, meaning basically people feel much more alert under bright light, and it's significant at this time point, but there's an overall effect of bright light exposure and it dampens the circadian amplitude. So as opposed to this big beautiful wave, there's a tinier wave. For the reaction times, we can see that there are significant improvements, but again, this does not depend on circadian clock phase. Here we resolve this part of the puzzle. So the circadian clock significantly affects subjective alertness and it improves subjective alertness significantly. But if we look at performance, it's significantly improved, but it's independent of the circadian clock. Now, if we combine our process S and our process C, we can kind of comprise what happens during the regular day. So here we have our circadian phase, degrees after Dilmo, on the x-axis, and our homeostatic component on the y-axis, so how long you've been awake. And if we can combine that, we can see what happens during the day. So this is the projected daily time course that's supposed to start at 8 a.m. and last for 13 hours. So we can see that there are some light-induced improvements in subjective alertness, but none of them occur during the projected daily time course. If we look at performance, however, we can see that there are loads of significant effects of bright light on performance, and lots of them occur during the daily time course, meaning that bright light during the day can induce effects on performance, even though it might not be perceived as such, because subjectively we don't perceive it. It's not just light intensity, because here, of course, we compared bright versus dim light, but again, it's also the spectral composition. So here again, we have this low versus high melanopic EDI light, and we don't find any effects on subjective sleepiness. But if we look at performance, we see very big, very robust effects. So here we have effects on the digit symbol substitution task, a task that measures visual scanning, the fractal 2-back, which is a memory task, and an emotion recognition task. And we can see that in high melanopic lighting, there are significant improvements in all these tasks. And it's not just that people perform a lot better, the effect sizes are really big. So if we plot out the individual curves between low melanopic light and high melanopic light, we can see that almost every individual significantly improves under high melanopic lighting. And that's not just for the digit symbol substitution task, but also for the fractal 2-back and for the emotion recognition task, indicating that it's a really robust effect. So there's really something going on here. Taking all of this together, it might suggest that the brain nuclei that we have for alerting effects of light might differ from those for performance effects, because we keep on seeing these performance enhancing effects of light independent of subjective alertness. And this is actually work by Tiffany Schmidt, who has shown in rodents that there are actually nuclei in the brain that are connected to the IPRGCs, so that are directly connected to the light photoreceptors, let's say, and that are completely independent of the SCN. So this is just a small hypothesis that it's possible that these performance enhancing effects are independent of alertness and that these go through different brain mechanisms overall. So a short summary, I hope I showed you today that light during the day, it's really difficult to induce subjective alerting effects of light. It's very much dependent on the amount of homeostatic sleep pressure, whereas light can directly affect mental performance. Circadian clocks significantly affect subjective alertness, and bright light reduces the amplitude a bit, and mental performance improves due to bright light, depending on the circadian clock as well. And of course, this is work I did not do by myself. So from the University of Groningen, I particularly want to shout out Roelof Hut, Domien Beersma, and Tom Wolders, who worked with me intensely on all these projects. And from Stanford University, my professor here, Jamie Seitzer. And if there's time for questions, I'm happy to take some, or feel free to shoot me an email. Thank you.